If you could cure the coronavirus this week, but it meant killing some of those who had recovered from it, would you? This question is what gives philosophy professors jobs and people like us serious moral dilemmas. There are two justifications on either side. One says that, well, by killing some of these people, we could use the antibodies that are present in their bodies that already defeated corona, and therefore we could save many more people, and that would somehow justify their deaths. The other side is that it is simply not morally right to kill people solely for the benefit of others. What it really comes down to is whether you prioritize scientific advancement or human morals. This question is in whole regarded as bioethics. Bioethics is somewhat of a recent science, and in the 1950s it was not at the forefront of scientists' minds. Particularly in 1951, when a low-income black woman went into the Johns Hopkins charity ward in Baltimore hoping for treatment for her cervical cancer. She was granted treatment, but unbeknownst to her or her family, her cells were taken from her without her consent, without any compensation, and without her knowledge whatsoever. Her cells were then taken to a man named George Gay, a scientist who had been trying to get cells to procreate on their own within a petri dish. Up until this point, he had failed. He had also non-consensually taken the cells of numerous other patients. She was not the first. However, she was the first to go down in history. It's important because we're talking about something that happened 70 years ago that we contextualize it historically. On NPR's Talk of the Nation, Rebecca Schlute, who wrote the book The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which mainly brought this into the picture and actually brought this issue to my attention, talked about how informed consent wasn't even a concept in 1951 when her cells were taken from her. This wasn't even a conversation that scientists were having yet. And racism was still heavily prevalent in society, which is why she had to be treated in a different ward, and the charity ward often was taken advantage of because since they weren't paying, they were very grateful for what was happening to them, but in turn the healthcare system at that point took it upon themselves to really use them for whatever purposes they saw fit as a sort of collateral instead of just actually putting the charity into the charity ward. So, fair enough, back in 1951, they didn't have the tools or the education to understand social justice enough to know that it is not okay to take cells away from someone who doesn't know about it, much less to take it away from a woman dying from a tumor in her cervix. Well, so you would think that Henrietta, now in modern day, would be compensated for what happened to her, but unfortunately, that same year, Mrs. Lacks died of that tumor, and she was survived only by 5 children and a petri dish of her cells. Unlike any of the other harvested cells, Henrietta's cells kept procreating outside of her body. This was a scientific phenomenon, and it remains to be one today. This had never happened before, and George Gay was ecstatic. However, he didn't do what many would, and patent the cells, nor did he gain any money off of them. What he actually did was he distributed the cells to as many of his scientist colleagues as he could, in turn making it a very widespread resource. So then when we look back today and we try to think about, oh, well, maybe she should have been compensated for her cells. Well, it's kind of hard to trace because the people who took the cells from her never actually got a penny from it. However, third parties have made billions and billions of dollars off of her cells. And these numbers actually are always increasing exponentially, so it's really hard to track how much money has actually been made because of her sacrifice. This was actually reported in the book The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Schlute, that talks about her entire life as well as what happened to her, as well as her children. So also, the book mentions that the family didn't receive a dime of these profits, and when it became known that these cells were being used for a lot of things and that her family didn't know anything about it, someone reached out to tell them. And they were still living as a low-income family in Baltimore, so when someone reached out to them and told them what had happened, they thought that their mother was still alive because they didn't understand the scientific processes behind keeping a cell alive. This is a real moral issue, and it's a bioethical issue. Her children actually still don't have health care today, although her cells have played a critical role in the health care of so many others around the world. HeLa cells were actually named for the first two letters of her first name and her last name, Henrietta Lacks. Her cells were actually essential in the research of the polio vaccine as well as much of the AIDS research. It's still used in cancer research today and a lot of other scientific measures. So after these cells were widespread throughout the scientific community, some German researchers decided to sequence the cells and all of its genetic data and publish it to a public database. However, if you're familiar with genetics, you know that if someone publishes your mother's genetic data online, then you can draw various conclusions about the genetic makeup of all of her descendants. This was seen as a bioethical problem, and for the first time in all of the mistreatment of the Lacks family, the National Institute of Health stepped in and told the German researchers that that could not happen and protected their privacy and their data more. As a society, we failed Henrietta Lacks in 1951. That we can't change. But we continue to fail the Lacks family because time and time again we keep prioritizing scientific advancement over human morality. Many say that we must excuse what happened to Henrietta Lacks because without it, people would still be suffering from polio and people would have way less resources than they have now to deal with AIDS. However, that's not the case. We've created a very polarized discourse on this, that if this hadn't happened, then none of this would happen. But that is solely not the case. The issue is this. We do not need to capitalize off of the backs of those who are unfortunate, those who have less than us, in order to create scientific advancement. We did not need to steal the cells of a poor black woman in Baltimore in order to heal polio or AIDS. What we could have done is gotten her informed consent, and we could have compensated her family. The truth of the matter is that human morality has to come before scientific advancement, because science will advance nevertheless. But if we let human morality fall behind us, then as a human race, what are we striving for?